Hello, I'm Natasha. Welcome back to my channel. This is the second part of my two-part series regarding the causes of the current conflict in Ukraine. In my last video, I mentioned that the main cause of this conflict was NATO expansion. However, there are a number of other causes which I consider to be important. The first being the failure of the Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements were a series of international agreements which sought to end the Donbass War. This war was fought between armed separatist groups and the armed forces of Ukraine. The Donbass region includes the Donetsk and Lugansk areas of Ukraine. Prior to 2014, these were key industrial areas for Ukraine. Ethnic Russians formed the largest minority in Donbass, and indeed in Ukraine overall. The Donbass War started after the coup in 2014, which was backed by the West and successfully led to the removal of President Yanukovych, who was the elected president of Ukraine. The separatists in Donbass did not recognise the new government, they did not recognise the coup, and held President Yanukovych to be the leader of Ukraine according to the constitution of Ukraine. The separatist areas therefore demanded a referendum on greater autonomy or to join Russia. This started a conflict between the government of Ukraine and the separatist areas, which led to the implementation of the Minsk agreements, Minsk I and later Minsk II. Some of the terms of the Minsk agreement included to ensure an immediate bilateral ceasefire, to ensure the monitoring and verification of the ceasefire by the OSCE, which is the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, decentralisation of power, including through the adoption of the Ukrainian law on temporary order of local self-governance in particular districts of Donetsk and Lugansk, as well as several other terms. However, the Minsk agreements did not end the fighting between the Donbass and the Ukrainian government. Between 2014 and early 2022, over 14,000 people died in this conflict. The French and German leaders Angela Merkel and François Hollande admitted that they never intended to satisfy the agreements. They just wanted more time to arm Ukraine. There were almost daily violations of this agreement. If you look at the OSCE spot reports, you can see violations recorded there. For instance, on the 11th of October 2015, there was shelling around Donetsk airport, and these violations were ongoing up until the start of Russia's military operation. Another example is on the 10th of November 2021, the OSCE recorded 343 ceasefire violations, including 52 explosions. Obviously, this was a concern for the Russians, the failure of these agreements and the treatment of the separatist areas where there were large Russian minorities. And I do believe that this was a big factor in the run-up to the conflict. Now, there are other reasons which I also want to touch upon in this video. First, the issue of the Nazification of Ukraine, which Vladimir Putin mentions as a reason for the current military operation to denazify the country. According to Putin, there are far-right ultranationalist militias in Ukraine, one of them being Azov. Azov is a far-right all-volunteer infantry military unit whose members are ultranationalist and are accused of harbouring neo-Nazi and white supremacist ideology. As a battalion, the group fought on the front lines against separatists in Donetsk. After Ukraine introduced legislation to enshrine the Ukrainian language, many of the Russian-speaking soldiers in Ukraine defected to the rebels. The army could not be trusted to maintain loyalty, and these nationalist militias were created. I think that it is important to note that the Russian-speaking soldiers who defected took issue with a law introduced by Ukraine, which was the 2019 law on protecting the functioning of the Ukrainian language as the state language. and this was signed by the then President Poroshenko. This law gave priority to the Ukrainian language in more than 30 spheres of public life, in particular in public administration, media, education, science, culture, and advertising. It was seen by the Russians as a way to eradicate the Russian language from state affairs and to restrict its use. Russian speakers took issue with the law as they claimed that it breached the UN Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to National, Ethnic, Religious, and Linguistic Minorities. This declaration enshrines the rights of people belonging to minorities to practice their own language, religion, and culture. So many Russian speakers defected to the rebel groups. The Azov unit and the other militias received backing from Ukraine's interior minister in 2014, as the government had recognised its own military was too weak to fight off the separatists and therefore relied on paramilitary volunteer forces. The presence of neo-Nazis in Ukraine has been confirmed by the correspondent for the US-based magazine The Nation, who wrote in 2019 that Ukraine is the world's only nation to have a neo-Nazi formation in its armed forces. Given how much the former Soviet Union suffered at the hands of Nazi Germany, it is understandable that it would not want the presence of neo-Nazis near its borders. In fact, I'm not quite sure why any country would want the presence of neo-Nazis. As I have mentioned previously, there are additional reasons as to why Russia felt compelled to launch its current military operation. It is my view that if Ukraine had joined NATO and Russia found itself fighting a war against the whole of NATO, then this would have been a far more dangerous situation for the world. Russia's actions appear to be preemptive to stop Ukraine joining NATO. At the moment, the current conflict appears to be a proxy war between the West and Russia. And although dangerous, I believe that if Ukraine had joined NATO, then the situation could have been a lot worse.